Hello everyone. So in this session we will learn about types of shares. Now types of shares. So first type is equity shares. So equity shares are owners of the company and they have voting rights, and the liability of the equity shares is limited to their investment per share. That is, if say there is some uncalled capital, then uncalled value of the shares, so the liability of the equity shareholders is limited to that particular uncalled value per share or uncalled capital. Now, so equity shares are owners of the company, then they have voting rights, and their liability is limited to value per share that they invest. Now, second type is preference shares. So, as the name itself suggests, these preference shareholders are also owners of the company, but these preference shareholders have preference over equity share when it comes to payment of dividend and payment of capital in case of winding up of the company. But the preference shareholders do not have a voting rights. Now let us understand what is the preferential treatment in case of payment of dividend and payment of capital in case of winding up of a company. Let us see one example here. Say there is a company and there are 40,000 preference shares and 60,000 equity shares in the company. Now, in 2019, the profit after tax and everything was 5 lakh of the company. Now, it was decided that the dividend of rupees 2 is given to preference shares and 3 to equity shares. So now, dividend for preference shareholders will be given first. So 40,000 preference shares into 2 rupees per share, so that is 80,000 rupees, and equity shares 60,000 equity shares into 3 rupees per share, so that comes to 1,80,000 rupees. So 5 lakh minus 80,000 minus 1,80,000, so 2,40,000. Now this 2,40,000 will go into reserves. Now in 2020, the total profit was 1 lakh after tax. Now this 1 lakh, it is decided that preference shareholders will get dividend of 2 rupees per share. Now if we see last year's total dividend was 80,000 to preference shares plus 1,80,000 to equity shares. So total was 2,60,000. But this year the profit is 1 lakh. So it is not sufficient to pay dividend to both preference shareholders and equity shareholders. So now in this case, the dividend will be paid to preference shareholders. So dividend of 80,000 will be paid to preference shareholders. So equity shareholders will not be paid dividend. So either this 20,000 will be divided to 60,000 shares to pay a dividend to equity shareholders, so that their equity shareholders will get less dividend per share as compared to previous year, or this 20,000 may be transferred to reserves since there is no sufficient profit. So this 80,000 preference share dividend will be given to preference shareholders. So the preference shareholders get a preferential treatment over equity shareholders in case of payment of dividend. So preference shareholders, companies go for issuing of preference shares since the cost of preference shares is less as compared to debt. Now, Payment of capital in case of winding up of the company. Now let us see the example for this. Now, in case of winding up of the company, the preference shareholders get preferential right over equity shareholders. Now say a company is winding up. Assets are 10 lakhs and the liabilities are 5 lakhs. So after paying off all the liabilities, the total amount that remains is 5 lakhs. So now preference share capital is 4 lakh rupees and equity share capital is 6 lakhs rupees. Now this out of this 5 lakh that is remaining, first right will be of preference shareholders. So preference shareholders will get 4 lakhs and then balance 1 lakh will be divided to equity shareholders in the proportion of their shares. So if we see, the preference shareholders will get a preferential treatment over equity shareholders while paying the capital due at the time of dissolution, at the time of winding up of a company. So now let us see what are the various types of preference shares. So various types of preference shares. So first is on the basis of dividend. So on the basis of dividend, there can be two types. One is cumulative preference shares and non-cumulative preference shares. Now in cumulative preference shares, what happens is, say if there is some insufficient profit in a particular year where the preference share dividend cannot be paid in that year, then in the year whenever there is a sufficient profit, they have to pay a cumulative dividend, that is the outstanding dividend for all the previous year. Say for year 1 there was no sufficient profit, year 2 there was no sufficient profit, year 3 there is a sufficient profit to pay a preference share dividend. So in year 3, the dividend will be paid for year 1 plus year 2 plus year 3 before paying a dividend to equity shareholders. That is known as a cumulative preference share. Non-cumulative preference shares is opposite of cumulative preference share. Say in year 1 there is no profit, so no dividend paid. Year 2 there is no profit, so no dividend paid. Year 3 there is a profit. So for year 3, if it is a non-cumulative preference shares, then the dividend will be paid only for year 3. Now in India, if nothing is specified, then the share will be, preference share will be always cumulative preference share. Okay. Now on the basis of dividend, there are two more categories. Let us. So on the basis of additional dividend, there are two categories. One is participating preference shares and other one is non-participating preference shares. So now participating preference shares and non-participating preference shares. Now in the year wherein there is a surplus profit, in case of participating preference shares will get the extra dividend above their fixed dividend. So if they get extra dividend above the fixed dividend, then it is known as a participating preference shares. In case of non-participating preference shares, they will get only fixed dividend even if there is a surplus profit. So they won't get any extra dividend. So that is non-participating preference shares. So unless otherwise specified, all preference shares are non-participating preference shares. Next, on basis of redemption. So on basis of redemption, there are two. One is redeemable preference shares and other one is non-redeemable preference shares. So shares are issued in case of redeemable preference shares. The shares are issued on the condition that the company will repay the amount of shares after a fixed period of time. Whereas in case of non-redeemable preference shares, shares are issued without any condition of repayment of the amount of the share. Now, as per section 55 of the Companies Act, no company limited by shares can issue irredeemable or non-redeemable preference shares. So they have to issue only redeemable preference shares. That is, the shares which the company will repay after certain period of time, and that time should not exceed 20 years. Only in case of some infrastructure project, the exception of the 20 years is extended. That is, in those cases, the redeemable preference shares for the period over the 20 years can be issued by the company only for certain infrastructure project which are specified. Otherwise, the redeemable preference shares, the tenure of the redemption should not exceed 20 years. That is as per section 55 of the Companies Act. So unless otherwise specified, rather wherein the company is limited by shares, it is always a redeemable preference shares in India, and non-redeemable preference shares cannot be issued. Now the next one. On basis of convertibility. So there are two types. One is convertible preference shares and other one is non-convertible preference shares. Now, convertible preference shares, they have a right to convert it into equity share capital. So option is given to preference shareholders to convert it into equity share capital after a fixed period of time. Whereas in non-convertible preference share, there is no such option of converting a preference share to equity share. So unless otherwise specified, all the preference share are non-convertible preference shares. So this were various types of shares and then the types of preference shares based on the payment of dividend, then payment of additional dividend, then on the basis of redemption and on the basis of convertibility. So unless otherwise specified, all shares, that is all preference shares, are usually cumulative preference shares and they are non-participating, then they are redeemable and non-convertible. So this was about types of shares.